Okay, let's travel back to the late Roman Empire for a minute. Picture this. One of the most brilliant minds of the era comes up with an educational plan. But this plan is so radical, so completely out there, that it flips everything people thought they knew about success, ambition, and even what it means to be a good parent. We're going to dive into this, well, this almost unthinkable idea.
So put yourself in the shoes of a parent back in the 4th century. You want what's best for your kid, right? A good career, some money, a respected name, the usual stuff. Then the most famous preacher of the day comes along and tells you, forget all that. He says the only real education, the only path to what truly matters, is to send your son away to live with monks in the mountains. I mean, can you imagine? This was the genuinely shocking argument from one of early Christianity's biggest names.
So, who was the guy making this totally audacious claim? His name was John, but you probably know him by his nickname, Chrysostom. That literally means golden-mouthed, which tells you everything you need to know about his skills as a speaker. But here's the thing, his ideas didn't just come from books. Oh no, his journey was forged in some pretty extreme personal conviction.
Okay, so John was born around 354 AD in Antioch, and he had it all. His family was high-ranking military, so he had every advantage you could think of. But then, as a young man, he just walks away from it all. For 6 years, he completely rejects city life and goes to live in the mountains. We're talking a seriously harsh, solitary existence. When he finally comes back, he's a completely different person. He gets ordained, and his preaching becomes legendary, so much so that he ends up as the Archbishop of Constantinople, the top job in the Eastern Church, before he eventually dies in exile. You've got to believe that time he spent out in the wild, that's what shaped everything he came to believe.
You know, as a young guy, Chrysostom really had two paths in front of him. On one hand, you've got the school of this super famous pagan teacher, Libonius. This was the fast track, right? The Ivy League of its day. Go here and you're set for a killer career in law or government. But Chrysostom thought it was all just hollow. He literally called it empty little words. Then you have the other option, the Ascario of Diodorus. This was a Christian community, all about studying scripture and spiritual growth. For him, the choice was a no-brainer. One path was about status and career, the other was about real spiritual wisdom. So what would make someone do that? What drove him to make such a drastic choice? Well, he was just completely disgusted by the corruption he saw all around him in the city of Antioch. The courts, the theaters, he called the whole scene a turbulent storm. So he ran. And I mean, he really ran. For 6 years. He spent 4 of those years with an old hermit, and then 2 years completely alone, in a cave. Think about that level of discipline. This whole experience is what gave him his moral authority, right? When he talked about virtue, he wasn't just talking theory. He had actually lived it in the most extreme way imaginable.
Now, to really get why he proposed something so extreme, you have to understand the world he was living in. Because at the time, this whole monastic movement was in a state of crisis. It was under attack from 2 very powerful directions. It was basically fighting a war on 2 fronts.
The first threat? It was coming from the top. The Roman state itself. The emperor, a guy named Valens, was actively persecuting monks. He just saw them as a threat. I mean, these guys refused to join the army, they rejected traditional Roman values, so he cracked down. He issued a decree forcing them into military service. And according to one historian, the persecution got brutal. We're talking reports of monks being drowned en masse in the river just outside the city. This wasn't just disapproval. This was a state-sponsored war on the whole monastic lifestyle. And the second front? This one was a little closer to home. It was cultural. It was coming from Christian families themselves. You know, the dream for the average dad back then was for his son to make it big. Chrysostom even writes about it, how fathers would point to some successful guy and say, look at him, he's got a high-powered job, he's rich, he married a wealthy wife, he's got a huge house. So for these parents, when their son decided to become a monk, it felt like a total failure, a waste, like he was throwing away everything the family had hoped for. So, okay, you've got this war on 2 fronts. What does Chrysostom do? He launches this brilliant counterattack. But it's not a sermon, not this time. It's a book, a whole treatise called Against the Opponents of the Monastic Life. And it was a direct, logical, and really passionate argument aimed right at those Christian dads who were trying to stop their sons from becoming monks.
And his argument, it's just a masterclass in persuasion. He builds his case piece by piece. First off, he gets everyone to agree. The city is a moral mess, a turbulent storm of corruption. Check. Then he says, you know all that worldly success you want for your kids? That's actually a spiritual trap. It's a path to ruin. Ouch.
Third, he reminds these parents that their most important job isn't to set their kids up with a career, it's to look out for their eternal salvation. So when you lay it all out like that, his conclusion feels almost inescapable. The only logical, the only responsible, the only truly loving thing to do is to send your son to the one safe place there is, the monastery.
But here's where it gets really clever. The true genius of his whole argument is how he completely reframes the debate. He takes a word that everybody in the Greco-Roman world knew, a word they all respected, and he just flips its meaning on its head.
That word was philosophy. Philosophy. Now, for the Greeks, philosophy was all about thinking, about intellectual debate. But Chrysostom basically hijacks the term. He says, no, philosophy isn't about sitting around thinking abstract thoughts. It's about how you live. It's the practical, day-to-day pursuit of the only wisdom that actually matters, the wisdom that leads to eternal salvation. So those monks out in the desert, they weren't weirdos or dropouts. In his view, they were the real philosophers.
And you might wonder, was this just a casual thing? How important was this idea to him? Well, get this. Scholars have gone through and counted. In this one pretty short book, Chrysostom uses the word philosophy, or a version of it, 67 times. 67! He is hammering this point home over and over again. The life of a monk is the life of a true philosopher.
All right, so the case seems pretty closed, right? For Chrysostom, you have to flee the corrupt world and head for the monastery. End of story. But then, about 10 years later, he writes another book about education, and it seems to say something completely different. It really makes you wonder.
Yeah, when you put the two books side by side, the difference is pretty stark. In that first book, Against the Opponents, the problem is the corrupt city, and the solution is clear: run away to the monastery. But in the later book, On Vainglory, he's tackling a different problem: bad parenting. And his solution? Help your son find a good wife and get married early to protect his virtue while living in the world. He barely even mentions the monastery. What's going on here?
So what gives? Did the Golden Mouth change his mind? Did he go soft on his radical ideas? Well, most experts who've studied this say no. They don't see it as a contradiction, but as an adaptation. See, Chrysostom was a pastor, first and foremost. In that first book, he's like a general, defending his troops, the monks, from a major attack. In the second book, he's more like a local priest, giving practical, real-world advice to families. He was a strategist, using different plays for different situations.
And that really leaves us with the big question at the heart of all this. When you see a powerful thinker change their message, is it because they've changed their mind? Or are you seeing the brilliance of a master communicator who's just changing their strategy to win the bigger war? In his case, a war for souls, one battle at a time. It's a question that really pushes us to look past the surface, to understand the context. And honestly, it's just as relevant now as it was back in the 4th century. Thanks so much for digging into this with me.